Could each speaker briefly explain their relationship with Dr. Sailhamer and the influence he had on your life? So you can start however you want. Go whatever order you'd like.
Go ahead, Seth.
All right. Well, it's good to be here. So where do you begin? He said, I can't open the Bible without feeling Dr. Sailhamer's influence, and it's literally that. But I think it began, I was living in Israel at the time, and I'd always had this cognitive dissonance between a statement in the New Testament: if you believe me, you believe Moses. Or if you believe Moses, you believe me because Moses testified about me. And so I believed it because I believed the New Testament was God's word, but I just couldn't figure out the statement. There was cognitive dissonance. And so somebody had recommended, I was working through some discipleship material, the Pentateuch as narrative, and I read the Pentateuch as narrative. This was back in 2000, I believe. And throughout the whole book, I kept telling myself, this is too good to be true, this is too good to be true. In fact, I was reading it while I'm an Israeli citizen, so I was doing Israeli military reserve duty. So I was in the back of an army jeep reading the Pentateuch as narrative. And literally, well, something's buzzing here, but too good to be true, too good to be true. And much to my amazing surprise, God opened the door for me to come to Southeastern to study with him because I knew I had to. And came here several thousand miles to study with him. And then the devastating news when I started my PhD here under Dr. Seminary, he was moving to Golden Gate. So we loaded up the truck and moved to Beverly Hills, that is. And so we followed him out. And I guess probably one of the most amazing privileges is that myself and Dr. Kevin, we were his last PhD students. And he demonstrated to me on so many levels what it was like to be Christ-like, what it was like to love the Word of God, his passion for the Hebrew Bible. So there's not a day that goes by that I'm not feeling his influence on my life.
That's great. Dr. McKenzie?
Yeah, so I was on staff with a campus ministry and was just kind of getting my feet under me there, but I was already feeling like I had to be a historian, a real historian, to study the Bible, and was thinking about doing these historical studies, and was not real excited about that because that's not really where my interests lie. I wanted to learn how to study the Bible, but thought that's what needed to take place. And I started taking Hebrew from a guy at my seminary, or a guy at my church out in Lincoln, Nebraska. And lo and behold, that was one of Dr. Sailhamer's students. So that was in 1996, and the desire to learn Hebrew and Greek and to learn more hermeneutics only grew under his tutelage. So we began to think about seminary, and I remember I had a wife and 2 children at that time. My wife was pregnant with our third, and I remember emailing Dr. Sailhamer because I knew he used to be at Trinity, and then he was in California. I didn't know for sure where he was. I heard he was in Minnesota. So I emailed him and said, hey, I'm thinking about coming to Southeastern, which is where he had just landed a job. Will you be there for a few years? And he emailed me back, said, I can't guarantee that I'll be here for a few years, but I don't have any plans to leave. So with that in mind, we loaded up the truck. I'm trying to think of a rhyme here that could equal Seth's. But anyway, we headed east, young men, and anyway, started studying here, and I quickly wormed my way into being his TA, and looked after his house a couple times, got to know his wife and children. Anyway, it was great time. And like Seth, I think, we've all heard these kind of stories from his Trinity days, but I was in Sunday school class with him, and it was amazing the kindness and humility that he showed towards towards the people in the Sunday school class, and just the kind of real easygoing attitude he had toward them, and loved them, and ministered to all of us. It was wonderful.
It's great.
Well, for me, I've been a student here at Southeastern forever, and I just joined the Evangelical Theological Society, and I'd received my first journal from them, and I was going to read it from cover to cover. I only read one article out of that, and that was the first one, and it was The Messiah in the Hebrew Bible by Dr. Sailhamer. And just as I do today, I usually don't see who it's by. I just read the title and say, that looks interesting. So I was like, who is the guy who wrote this? And it ended up being John Sailhamer, who I had no idea who he was, but he was actually here. So I was in the college at the time. So read it. It really resonated with me, and seeing the Old and New Testament as really one seamless story, which is something I struggled with personally. And so I knew when I got up to seminary that I would take him. I took Hebrew 1 and 2 again in seminary to learn how to teach students well, and he was my professor, and he had an amazing way of teaching Hebrew to make it simple rather than introduce you to all the exceptions to the rule. And so Dr. Sailhamer not only impacted me in my theology and the way I approach the Old Testament and reading it for the text and allowing the text to actually, the Old Testament text to speak to me as a Christian, but also influenced my teaching to Hebrew students. Last semester I got to teach for the first time, and they heard about cosmic haystacks and things like that are direct from him. But he just had a passion about teaching students in a way that they could understand biblical Hebrew, and that's his big impact on me.
Excellent. Great introduction to Dr. Sailhamer personally. Let's move on now to his research interests and his impact on scholarship. So let's begin with this. Since Dr. Sailhamer's research focused extensively on the Pentateuch, could you explain his compositional approach to the Pentateuch? How does the compositional approach to the Pentateuch inform our understanding of the message of the Pentateuch? And I realize that question could be the only question we ask here, but we do have a couple other important questions that will illuminate that question. But at least spend some time sketching his compositional approach, if you could.
Well, I'll start real quick just with maybe a foundational statement that I think he would want us to start with. I think, again, we're aware here that, he's watching us right now, and he did not like to be explained by his students. So, but anyway, with a great deal of fear and trepidation, exactly. So I think one thing that to start off, he would want his approach, whatever it was to arise from the documents themselves, from the texts themselves. So when you look at the text of the Pentateuch, or somewhere else in the latter prophets, or the writings, Proverbs, Psalms, Isaiah, whatever that was, he would want your approach to be reflective or a correlate to the way it was put together. And I think this is how he saw the Pentateuch put together, given to us by the author. And that would be one foundational statement I think he would maybe agree with, of his approach.
The focus on the macro structure of the Pentateuch and how you derive meaning.
Maybe macro structure, but again, however it's put together.
Yeah. Okay.
So if macro structure plays into that, okay. But if not, then however it's put together.
Okay.
Seth, you take a shot at the.
Yeah, no, it's.
He'll be more patient now.
I tell you. So I think one of the things that comes to my mind immediately when you think of compositional approach is that books are made. And I think that was kind of, it took me, I heard him say it every year for years, and I was probably one of the slowest students, and it took me about 7.5 years, maybe even longer, even after I left, that it finally occurred to me what he was actually talking about, and I think I know what you're talking about, Dr. Sailhamer. No, it's but that books are made, and so trying to see the ways in which the materials of the book have been carefully and strategically arranged, and along those lines then books are made, and there are seams that bind the major sections of that book into a whole. And it's amazing to see the ways in which these seams show up across the biblical literature, and the types of things you find in those seams. And so that's what I would argue, that when you look at the way the books are made, for me, when I approach any book, including the Pentateuch, I'm looking at the introduction, I'm looking at the conclusion, and I'm looking at the ways in which the material has been arranged with seams. And maybe just one kind of an anecdote. When you think about the message of the Torah or the message of even the Hebrew Bible, I remember hearing that the Messiah was kind of a marginal topic in the Hebrew Bible because he's only mentioned maybe 2% of the time in the Hebrew Bible, and therefore there are much more important things, which always is kind of hard for me. But then kind of the whole notion of, well, who's the hero of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? It's not the beaver, even though the beaver shows up more than Aslan, right? So it's not quantity, it's quality. And so what he helped me to see with the macro structure or with the composition of the Pentateuch was that you do have crucial in the structure this notion of the last days. And that's the kinds of things you find in seams in almost every other book of the Hebrew Bible. So much so that it can't be coincidence. There has to be intelligent design.
So when you say seams, are you thinking especially maybe of some of the major poems in the Torah? Could you elaborate on that a little bit, what you mean by seams?
Yeah, so you have within the plot structure of the Torah, you have these major transitions into new movements, which you have these larger sections that can be bound together into sub-themes. And it's typically within the transition from major section to major section that you have these large poems. But interestingly enough, even in smaller levels, you have even smaller poems that typically that link these transitions. And so it's these poems that these major poems that come at the end of the patriarchal narrative, right? So you've got Genesis 49, or the wilderness one, or even the Song of the Sea. In the end of the Torah, you've got the Song of Moses and the blessing of Moses. And so that's what he would understand as seams of the book.
Right. Okay. That's helpful. Did you have anything you wanted to add, Dougald?
I think one thing that went back, and because I don't want to misspeak for Dr. Sailhamer either, so I was looking over my notes of some works, and I think one of the criticisms that I saw him get a lot was that it doesn't deal with everything, like the seams don't deal with everything in the Pentateuch, but he often said in his writings that it's the one that explains the most, or these seams explain the most of the themes that appear in the Pentateuch. So I think that's important to remember about the seams, but also that everything that is in the text, both at a micro level and a macro level, has a purpose that it serves. Just like a video camera, when it zooms in on something that you think is insignificant on the screen, the text is telling you what is significant in the narratives and in the macro structure. And I think that's the importance of understanding his seams and seeing the way that he saw the Pentateuch, was that it brings up those things that are important for the reader to know what they should be looking for in these narratives, whether they've just recently finished those narratives or they've got the narratives that they're coming up on, that it will prepare them to read those better as well. So,
I think what both of them mentioned is this idea of like giving us the important details or highlighting, and this could be called prominence.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the poems or the way the author has given us these seams and his style at these seams that again shows us what is important for him, because the author, like Seth said, arranged these materials, he selected these materials. Obviously there's other notions, other concepts or ideas or words in these other historical type works that he's selected and is arranging for us to communicate this message, about the last days. So.
Okay. Great, that's very helpful. So the arrangement of the Torah, the arrangement of a biblical book, the arrangement of a small section like Exodus 1:15 communicates the meaning and the message that the author intends, is maybe a good kind of summary. Helps to, right. Okay, so that's helpful. The follow-up question is, how is that useful outside the Torah? You guys have alluded to that. And then specifically, Dr. Postell, we want to ask you how this compositional approach is useful in New Testament interpretation. So if you want, you can comment on the compositional approach in the prophets or the writings, or if you guys want to say more about that, or if you'd like to move right to New Testament interpretation, we can do that as well. If you feel like there's more to be said, maybe with the prophets or the writings, feel free.
Well, I would just say again that this kind of quote-unquote compositional approach, which was probably his term that he, I think, would have liked, not canonical. Or he also, wrote on the grammatical approach, right, or grammatical historical,
yeah.
Historical grammatical. But he wanted it to be, obviously derived from the text, but. Again, you see this in lots of, basically all the other books. It takes different shapes, which is why we shouldn't necessarily be looking for poems,
Right.
at junctures,
Right.
because again, you're not going to find that in necessarily in other books. But you take any other book, and you're going to see the way the book was made or was put
Right.
together.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So whether it's Jeremiah or Proverbs or the Book of the 12 or Chronicles or Kings, whatever, you're going to see this aspect of being put together. Now I'll let Seth talk about the New Testament.
Yeah,
Well-
and the Gospels in particular.
Well, yeah, I would
think,
love to mention that, but I also want to say this, and it was really interesting. I remember Sailhamer talking about the kind of where the Messiah shows up in the Old Testament. And it, again, slow student, it took me many years to realize that there was actually a pattern, that the Messiah is not a random theme. It's a pattern. So when you start to actually look at what other scholars are saying or the structure of books, it's public knowledge. To find the macro structure of books is public knowledge. It's not that you're forcing your views, you're consulting with other scholars, but it's amazing when you start to see the ways in which this Messiah theme shows up on the seams. So, Zechariah 1 through 8, first part of Zechariah, 9 through 14, next part of Zechariah, right? It divides in half. Where does the Messiah show up? Zechariah 9, on the seams. Okay? When you look at other books, you look at the book of the 12 or the book of Hosea. Okay? The introduction concludes with Hosea chapter 3, which is the end of it's at the stitching of the book. Who shows up? Messiah in the last days. You look at the Aramaic section of Daniel, chapter 2 to chapter 7. Who's on chapter 2? The last days, the stone coming down from heaven, right? From the Son of Man in chapter 7. And so over and over again, you look at the macro structure of Psalms. Who's in the literary seams of the book? This exalted king in the tribe of Judah. Book of Proverbs. It's again and again. Chapter 30 is a complete transition into a whole nother genre. It's a literary seam. Who's there? The Son of God. And so what struck me as amazing is I could not explain the fact that the Messiah shows up so strategically in these seams, but for the fact that the Hebrew Bible was made with Messiah in mind. And that's what's amazing. Now, what I did is I just simply said, I want to apply Sailhamer's method to the New Testament. And so it's been amazing. I've done right now compositional analysis on the book of Acts, and you see the same types of things going on, literary seams, verbal, literary analogies, parallels. I applied it to the Gospel of Mark. I did it to the Gospel of Matthew. And I wish I could paint for you the Gospel of Matthew, but I'll just throw it out to you really quickly. And this is recent, like I've been working on Matthew for several years, but looking for the macro structure of the book. And so 1 through 4, you think about chapter 1 is the genealogy that actually quotes or alludes to the genealogy that begins in Genesis chapter 5, verse 1. Chapter 2, you've got Moses written all over it. Egypt, Pharaoh, he comes out of Egypt. Chapter 3, he goes through the waters of his baptism. Chapter 4, he goes through the wilderness to be tested and tempted. Then it begins, so that's the introduction. Then you have the body of the book, which is his fivefold discourse, right? The first discourse begins in chapter 5. He goes up a mountain brings his disciples, gives his law. The last discourse is on another mountain where he focuses on the last days, which is really interesting because that's already the shape of the Pentateuch, where Moses goes up the mountain, Sinai. Then his final discourse, Moses, it's about the last days. So you've got this fivefold discourse. Well, then you transition into the conclusion in chapter 26. What does Jesus do? After he comes down from this mountain, he makes a new covenant with his disciples. Then you come to the Great Commission, where now, rather than looking into the promised land, he's sending them out to conquer the world. And these are things that, when you start to look at the shapes of the book, it gives you a sense in which you're tracking with the author. You're looking at the ways in which these texts are alluding to other texts. You're looking at literary scenes within the books, and you're trying to describe the meaning of the whole. And I have found over and over and over again, when I just simply ask myself, how has this book been made? That the insights that you get from this are just profound. And so, again, and I would encourage you as we talk through these things to really learn to read whole books. Unfortunately with verses and chapters and things like that, people tend to have their favorite verse. But as I remember Sailhamer used to talk about, when you pull on this verse, what else in the book is going to wiggle? Right? And I would encourage all of us that as we think in terms of the ways in which these books are made, if I pull really hard on this verse, what else in the book is going to wiggle?
That's a good transition to the next question then. How can our students learn to do compositional analysis for themselves? Maybe what would be some resources you would recommend them read? Maybe some of Sailhamer's books, maybe some principles. Obviously, if they listen to what you just said, they can draw some application immediately when they read books of the Bible and sections of the Bible. But what would be some specific advice that you would give for learning to do this themselves?
Well, I think reading the text over and over again, both on a small level and a macro level, gives you a good idea of how to do that. I think watching for shifts, like Seth was talking about, when there's a drastic shift from narrative to poetry, or from poetry to prose, or to comment, that's helping you understand what's come before. And I think, trying to read through, when you're in that macro level, looking for themes that pop up again and again, and what pops up around them. Are there key terms that pop up around them that maybe clue you into what the author sees as important? And that's the big question, is what does the author see as important? And most of the time they're going to tell you. So I think that's about all I'll say to that, if you guys want to add.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, Dr. Sailhamer. When I'm teaching my students, I tell them one of the most important tools in biblical research. Sorry, Tracy, I apologize as well. Google. I said it. Let me finish. Let me finish. Okay, let me finish.
That's a new one I had.
I know, but let me finish. It'll be okay. So here's what's really the good news, is that macrostructures, they're public knowledge. That's the beautiful thing, is they're public knowledge. In other words, other people notice the literary structure of books. So we never want to impose. We want to see what's in the text. And so, but the bottom line is what a compositional approach does is it just simply finds the major divisions of the books. And then what I do, once I'm aware, and I'll find any possible way to do that. So, and when I started a sermon series through Mark, I cannot preach or teach anything until I know the shape of the book. I can't. I feel like I'm doing damage. So I just started Googling literary structure of Mark. And yeah, and I started to, and then you get on this trail of, you find out who the resources are, and it's public knowledge. But once you get a sense of the literary structure, and you can do this on your own, you can read and reread and read. I'm also a lay leader of a church. I don't have time to be an expert on every book of the Bible, but I know where to look. And Google's one resource. There's others, right? There are others. But the point is that once I've located the macro structure of a book, that's when I start to really look for the fingerprints of the author. And so one of the things I start looking for, introductions and conclusions to biblical books are crucial. They're so crucial. And so I use accordance. And so I'm already starting to look for what's known as literary inclusios. I'm looking for themes that show up in the introduction and conclusion that really close the book. Then I start to look at the literary, the transitions between the major sections, and I start to dig in there to try to see, are there things that connect this book together? Again, looking, and it would be the same as preparing a sermon. When you look at a sermon, what are you doing? You're looking for the main idea of a passage and the complements of that passage. How do the complements fit in with the main idea? It's just simply preparing an expository sermon on a whole book. And so those are the types of things, and then you start to get a sense of the tools in which authors, literary inclusios, so you have phraseology, unique words and terms that open and close sections, whether they're books, whether they're micro sections, smaller sections, whether they're even single texts. And so I'm looking for those things constantly to look for the fingerprints of the author. Why was this book made? And the important thing is you understand why books are made. You look for the message of the Bible by reading the Bible. And Tracy said that already. You want to understand the Bible by reading it and reading it again and reading it again and again and again. And you start to see the ways in which one narrative foreshadows later narratives. You start to see the ways in which the book holds together, hangs together as a whole. So in some sense, compositional analysis is easy. It really is not difficult. It took me years.
Which is why I was encouraged that I didn't have, I said historian at the beginning. I'm thinking archaeologist. I thought, okay, I've got to go dig a lot and kind of be an Indiana Jones if I want to be an Old Testament scholar. But I think what Sailhamer showed me is, no, really I need to read, which was, again, the gospel to me, because that's what I wanted to do, was kind of read. So again, great stuff. I think the only word that maybe they haven't mentioned, although they've said it, is this idea of repetition. Yeah. I mean, that's really where kind of all of these things begin, whether it's inclusios or, the words at the seams and this idea of repetition, which again, nobody's said it here yet, but can most easily be seen as you're reading Hebrew.
Yeah. That's just, or Greek.
For the New Testament,
And so, and maybe a work to follow up, many of you are familiar with, is Dr. Sailhamer's Introduction to Old Testament Theology. He lays out a lot of these principles in detail. It's a helpful resource if you're looking for further reading material. Okay, now another element of Dr. Sailhamer's compositional approach. Key to his compositional approach was intertextuality, or what some scholars refer to as interbiblical allusion. So how did he use intertextuality and interbiblical allusion in his own research? And maybe could you outline some of the criteria as we read the Hebrew Bible for identifying interbiblical allusion?
Well, I would say interbiblical allusion is a little bit something different. Although he might have commented on it a few times, and I don't think it's too far afield from where he might have wanted to take this if he'd have been given a little bit more time. But really what he outlined was intertextuality, not so much interbiblical allusion. And again, really, the way these authors make meaning is they repeat terms. They associate terms with one another. One of the critiques of Sailhamer's approach is that, he was often misconstrued as saying the Bible never points outside of itself. And I would just say, well, no, sure, it points out to it outside of itself, but it points out in reference to a whole, like he was saying, read whole books or whole units. But primarily, these authors would use words to associate different texts with one another. Mm-hmm. So again, that's this idea of repetition, structure, and compositional seams, and so on and so forth. So intertextuality for him was a reference of one text to another text.
And intentional.
Intentional reference, that's right, that's right. Intertextuality to the field at large, in particular literary theorists and so on and so forth, means something different.
Right, right.
But for him, it was an intentional reference of one text to another.
So could you, you alluded to some of them, could you guys outline some of the criteria for establishing those connections between texts, maybe that he identified or that you use in your own research?
So I'm a kind of guy that likes as simple as possible. I got to get the big picture in my head, whether it's a book or whether it's a methodology. And so with my students, we talk about 3 criteria. And it's more complex than this, but really there are 3 criteria. Can I tell you in Hebrew? It's easier. I've got all the terms in Hebrew. But Safa Meshutefet. So really the first one, and it's really crucial, would be unique common language. Shared language is crucial. Okay. The second would be then common themes or parallel themes or plot structure. So parallel plot structure. And the third is actually an external check and balance, would be history of interpretation. If you're the only guy in the world that's ever seen this particular connection, then you're the only guy that's seen it because it's not there. If that makes any sense. In other words, we want humility. It's so important because we don't want to read into the text what isn't there. And so unique common language, coupled with parallel plot structures, and then the check and balance outside of the text would be history of interpretation. Now, one thing I would love to challenge you that is just so underused is Jewish interpretation. It is so underused to a certain extent because most of it's never been translated. It's still in Hebrew. But you talk about, there are some, by the way, you should write down this website. It's called Safaria. It's a free website that's got
S-A-F.
I don't have my phone. Dr. Hogg has my phone. I can give you that link, but basically what it is, and it's got some English translations as well, basically on the whole Hebrew Bible, they've got, you click on any verse, and it gives you a whole wealth of Jewish interpretation of that verse, from whether it's the medieval period, whether it's the Midrashic period, whether it's up until the modern period, a wealth of information that many times I cannot find in modern scholarship that they notice these connections. And so I'll just go to the rabbinic literature, and they're on it. They see it. And so again, shared language, parallel plot structure, history of interpretation. And again, it can be more complex. There's some really good literature. I think that Richard Hayes has a really good explanation of the criteria of intertextuality. I think he does a really good job. There's an article by Jeffrey Leonard that also, it was a journal article.
2008, Journal of Biblical Literature.
You're sharp, man.
No, I just cited it in a paper.
Yeah. So, yeah.
It's like shared language. Shared language is in the title. If you look in our databases, you'll find it. Okay, so moving on to another aspect of Sailhamer's approach that you guys have alluded to multiple times. He believed that the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament is an explicitly Messianic book from beginning to end. And you've alluded to that already. Can you explain in more detail why he believed this with some examples? Maybe referencing a couple of texts where you'd see the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible.
Well, I can't think of any text off the top of my head because I'm in front of people without preparing for that question. But I will say that the way that he understood at least in my understanding, the way he understood the Hebrew Bible to be Messianic was that, in those themes you have the Messiah promise in the Pentateuch, and then the rest of the Bible is kind of commenting on that Messianic hope and expounding upon it as you go through until we get to Christ. And it's not Messianic in the sense of that you're reading the New Testament back onto the Old Testament, but that the New Testament is, the Old Testament has identified who the Messiah is, and the New Testament is just saying, here he is, essentially, if I can put it in a neat nutshell. Right. I'll let these guys talk about text, maybe.
Yeah.
Well, you've already alluded to quite a bit. I think there's pretty again, the seams, and one of his favorite stories was of when he sent a class over to the registrar's office at one of his the seminaries he taught at, called the Old Testament's Use of the Old Testament. And the registrar changed it to the New Testament's Use of the Old Testament. But his point was, no, the Old Testament, refers kind of to itself, or later authors would refer to earlier authors. And again, these references often show, messianic points. However, I think I would push back on the question ever so slightly, although he has an article, Messiah in the Hebrew Bible. That was his presidential address to ETS when he was president of ETS. But he challenged me several times to point out that the Messiah was not the only or the primary message, but one of several, or maybe even one at a particular moment in time. And I remember his one article that he wrote. He said that there is a fully developed eschatology in the Pentateuch, or in the Hebrew Bible. So lest we think that Messiah is the only maybe central theme of the Hebrew Bible, I think he'd push back a little bit and say, well, it's it's there, and it's obviously the important an important part of the message, but it wasn't the only aspect of the message. No, there was an important time element when these things would come to pass.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. Yeah. So maybe you're thinking, like you said, Genesis 49, Numbers 24, Deuteronomy 33. Look at some of those texts, and
well, like
he would have
Seth mentioned Proverbs 30. You have
30.
Ruth. You've got the seams in the Megillot, which keep bringing up David and Solomon. Long after they've bypassed from the scene. You've got the poems in Samuel that begin and end Samuel. I mean, the list just goes on and on, as Seth said.
Yeah. If you actually just look at what, even if you don't agree that, a lot of times scholarship kind of rejects messianic interpretations of certain passages, but the crazy thing is just look where they're located. Just step back, get yourself a chart of Google search macro structure of the book, right? And just look where these prophecies tend to show up. I mean, Amos 9, end of the book. Micah 5. The transition from it's in a key structural place in the book. The last days. Micah chapter 4.
Isaiah 2.
Isaiah chapter 2, the last days. Look at the amazing thing about Isaiah 2 and Micah chapter 4 is both of them fall on the seams of books. Last days. The last days in Hosea chapter 3. A seam of a book. Son of God. Proverbs. Again, over and over and over again. I'm always amazed. Psalm 72.
End of Joel.
Just get used to just stepping back and saying, okay, I realize that the Messiah is not going to be mentioned a ton of times, or eschatology, but where is it? Where do you find it? And over and over and over again, he's waiting for you in structurally significant places in the Bible. That to me, and that's only even something kind of recent. It's a bad analogy, but it's in the South, so I can use it. They have guns in the South, right? So when I was in the Army, we were given an M16, and you had to basically take this M16 apart and put it back together in the dark. And they had this firing chamber, and for those of you from the North, I'm sorry, you don't know what I'm talking about. But so there was a little pin that held the firing chamber together. It was really tiny, and I was sitting there in the Army, and one of my buddies says, "Don't lose that. That's the Sabbath pin." I said, "Sabbath pin?" I said, "What's the Sabbath pin?" He said, "That thing." I said, "If you lose it," and we were in the desert, it falls in the dust, it's gone. Such a small thing. It's the most important thing in the firing chamber. You lose that, you can use your gun for a paddle. You can use it for a baseball bat. It's not going to shoot. So I said, "Why is it called the Sabbath pin?" He says, "Well, if you lose it and the commander finds out, you have to stay home. You have to stay all Sabbath on the base. You can't go home." The Sabbath pin. And so this little pin, and just again for yourselves, because what we're talking about, if we're right, it ought not to be something that only this elite see. It ought to be public knowledge. So just look, think about where the Messiah shows up, think about where he shows up in the structure of the book, and then ask yourself, is this place structurally significant in the book according to other scholars? And you'll be amazed.
Excellent. I'll maybe ask one. We have two more questions. I'll ask one more, so we have at least 15 minutes for questions from the audience. How does Dr. Sailhamer's compositional approach compare to Brevard Child's canonical approach? What are the similarities and differences?
I'll take that.
Well, I'll start it. You want to start it, or are you okay?
No, you're good.
I find it interesting that they arise or emerge at roughly the same time, which is kind of interesting to me. But I don't think Sailhamer would have ever wanted, and he communicated this with several of us, he wouldn't have wanted his to be called a canonical approach. The subtitle to his Intro to Old Testament Theology, a canonical approach, was put there, or was given because of the editors and the publisher. He fought against that, but alas, lost that battle. He really liked this idea of composition, which again for Sailhamer, again, even though he has a chapter called Text versus Event, which I think is probably where all of us, or at least I think where most people cut their teeth on this idea, but he really saw his approach as grammatical historical. He really saw it as very grammatical, again, and he knew there was historical impulses, philology. He was all for all of this. Anything that had to do with words, all right, and especially as you search for words, in the scriptures. So, and not that Child is not, but again, with Childs you get more of the idea, especially his introduction, which I think he qualified ever so slightly later on. But his is slightly more, his arose from a theology or from a theological standpoint. His initial book, I think A Crisis in Biblical Theology, it was Christ and the Spirit of Christ, which I think is very appropriate, that we should never forget is the one, giving us this scripture and kind of the key to it. I think there's even a sentence in there where he says Christ is the key, and the kind of the theology. So I think Childs, again, possibly because of his own environment, maybe was more communal, church, and the importance of the church and church interpretation, which is why he had to come back and clarify it in a later article. And it was also more theologically grounded, if you will. Right. Because Sailhamer, he cared about one thing, that was the text, which he saw given at a particular moment in time, although, again, he didn't ever want to talk about that particular time, but it was very, very textual and tied explicit to strokes on a page. Nothing else mattered for him.
That's very helpful.
I think that's really good, helpful, because in a very real sense, community determines meaning, as opposed to an author determining meaning. I think also with Brevard Childs, he was thoroughly a product of critical scholarship, and so his notion of redaction and very complex genesis of texts, and he sort of his views rested on conclusions of critical scholarship, and but I think what you said was really helpful. Just think in terms of canon and community determining meaning, as opposed to author determining meaning.
And he in an article, I can't remember which article it was clarifying these things. He did say, I'm very interested in intentionality and intertextuality, that an author, refers to another author. So, he even had, because of critiques against him, he had to come back and kind of explain, no, I'm not talking about, community hermeneutics. And it is interesting that Sailhamer also had to kind of come back, or I don't know if he came back, but Sailhamer also explained the role of community in a later article in his life as well. So I think there is this real sense that, obviously community determines understanding and the way you convey ideas, the way you understand ideas, as does our community. I think the thing I would like to figure out a little bit more, and again, this has been a critique leveled probably at both of them, is kind of how structuralism, new structural, new criticism, how these ideas, again, constrained them or controlled, their own proposals. And I would like to think through, okay, how has that affected us, or how do we come out of that?
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think just to kind of distinguish Childs, at least the way that I've read him, and Sailhamer, is he'll talk about, you said he was theologically driven, but there are these theologies within the Pentateuch, let's say, or these sources that communicate different theologies about, say, certain types of sacrifices and different things like that. And so for him, it was a final synthesis of those competing theologies kind of coming together in the final form, which I think is different than the way that Sailhamer approached it, that it was very intentional in the shape and in the ordering of material, that this is kind of, like you said, he never really pinned down a time. But to me, that was the stark difference between Childs and him, was that he sees different theologies, at least in the works that I've read, he sees different theologies at play in the Old Testament that are being synthesized. And then, and it's just kind of a funny story about Dr. Sailhamer. I remember him one time saying in class about Brevard Childs that Childs hands the football off to him and he runs to the other end zone with it. And so that was his, for me, that's conceptually how I see the two of them working, is that they're very similar, but he's going a different direction. So.
I just as we're talking about Childs, I do remember when, Sailhamer had written his Intro to Old Testament Theology, Canonical Approach, and referred to evangelicals and our understanding of, kind of inspiration and the way we care for and treat texts, and he made a statement in there that Childs then later referred to in a follow-up article to these issues, and Childs really missed his point. I think Childs probably turned to the page or two and read it, and I think, again, I've got a great deal of respect for Childs and what he has done, but of which we probably have not given proper attention to. But at any rate, Childs, I think, missed his point. Matter of fact, it was the opposite point he was making throughout the entire book, really. That was his point in the book. I remember Sailhamer had just read that when a couple of us walked into his office one time. Were you there at that time?
I wasn't. I remember him making a statement in the class.
Yeah. Oh, he was so hurt. I mean, it really, really wounded him when Childs misunderstood his point on that time.
Well, this has been really helpful. We have about just under 10 minutes, 9 minutes now for questions. So we've got a microphone here, and I don't know if this is on. Looks like it's on. Logan's got a microphone, so I'll start with Benji.
I really have two questions, but I'll just start with one if we have time. If there's not a lot of this, I'll go to the second one later. The first one is, what does this approach, this compositional exegesis, miss? So like all approaches are geared towards focusing on certain things and always overlook other things. So what are the inbuilt deficiencies that need supplementation in a canonical approach?
Yeah, I'd really like to answer that, because I think one of the other questions, I was starting answering that. So one of the other questions was maybe a shortfall or something like this, or a critique. That
was the last question on the sheet.
And I think this is a great point and a great question. And the reason why I think it's a great question is precisely, for the reason Benji said. But I think really what these texts are more complex than many people, and I think we as evangelicals in particular, give them credit for or realize. And I think one of the reasons why scholarship has been so confounded or has so many different takes on this is because people tend to focus on different aspects of this complexity, which is kind of what Benji's point is, or in the question emerges. And of course, these texts they represent, or they contain, historically oriented texts that an author has now brought together and is using to communicate a historical, a future idea. So in that, when we take them this way, which I think is a very appropriate way to take them as evangelical scripture, but we obviously lose out on some of the theological developments, the theological diversity, the historical developments, the sociocultural information that they contain, which again is why you've got form criticism, redaction criticism, phenomenology, all of these criticisms, that over the last 250 years, if not earlier, how they treat them. So again, we have as our goal, this is my goal when I read these texts for the most part, is to understand the voice of God in them, which I think he communicated through human authors, human intentionality in their roughly final, in their approximate final shape. So to do that, I'm not going to talk a lot about the Babylonian culture that, for say, one of the documents that Moses picked up and used, that might have been what they originally contained, but that's not why he's using them. Now would be the statement that could.
So you're almost admitting some of the limitations.
Yeah.
And I don't use that word negatively, but it's like, well, these are things that we just aren't doing.
Yeah.
Right? This is what we are doing. This is what we're not doing.
Yeah. I mean, I don't see how we can, I don't see how we can help but see that.
Right.
I mean, Jeremiah wrote a letter, right, and he wrote it presumably from a historical, sociocultural context, and so on and so forth. But I'm not interested, in Jeremiah 29 or 36, whatever. I'm not interested in the original context. I think we could learn a lot about, diaspora. We could learn a lot about people going through, this is what scholarship's doing now, right? They're learning about how people respond to exile. Right? Well, I think that's probably valuable. It's not what I want to do though with these texts.
I would just follow up and just to maybe in my own personal testimonies, I remember starting to get a sense in which you have all these literary analogies and parallels between different figures in the Bible and how one text is shaped in light of another text. And I had this crisis of faith. Is this make-believe? And, it was, like even, you see the ways in which the New Testament is picking up on the Old Testament. You see these descriptions of Jesus that are obviously taken out of descriptions that you have in the Old Testament. And it took me quite some time to realize, right, that the compositional approach is not designed to answer those kinds of questions. And that's where, and Sailhamer was always really clear about this, is that historical studies are crucial, which he said it many times in the horse, he thought it was dead, it kicked him every time he passed. He was clear that historical studies were very important for apologetics. And I'll never forget, for me, we had a visiting professor at Israel College of the Bible, Craig Evans, who was talking about the Gospels in the context of Second Temple period. And it was so refreshing to me because I had spent so much time on the literary aspect of the Gospels that it created in me some tension that a really good historian solved. And so I think that this is something that we never want to neglect the fact that we have to have some apologetic basis. It's all beautiful and well that the point of the Exodus story is to engender faith in God. But if the Exodus, if it's a fairy tale, then what kind of faith and what kind of God am I believing in? And so the compositional approach is not designed to deal with those issues, but it's not opposed to it. And I think that Sailhamer he always briefly mentioned apologetics, but it was never something that he pursued in class. And so for me, it took years to deal with those issues and to realize that historical studies are crucial for my faith.
Yeah, I think that's probably where I've shifted in my approach to compositional theology, is including some of those social issues those other ancient Near Eastern texts in my study. Now, again, the compositional approach is not opposed to those things, but it doesn't deal with those things. I think compositional theology in itself is great for reading the text and understanding it, but understanding the significance of that text in its culture maybe. We can expound upon that a little bit more. And what I mean by that is, like, at my church, we just went through Genesis 15, which is the part where, Abraham, splits the animals and has the doves and all this covenant imagery from an ancient Near Eastern context. And while we read that text, that was really strange to me for years. Like, I cannot pick up from this text what is going on. Like, I don't understand the significance of it. But when you look at that covenant ceremony in contrast to the ancient Near Eastern context, you see something different. Whereas two people go through the ancient Near Eastern the covenant ceremony in the ancient Near Eastern context, only God is going through in Genesis 15. So that says something different, and either a critique or or an improvement upon what the ancient Near Eastern text is saying. And so for me, that wasn't a crisis of faith necessarily. I mean, it was before, but in seeing it in that lens, I see it as a critique and of the other religions, that they're incomplete in some way. Or you look at the ancient wisdom literature of the words of Amenemope, which are going through in Proverbs, that are going through about 4 or 5 times in that section of Proverbs. And what's the difference between that and what's in Proverbs? You have one is the fear of the Lord is crucial. So even though you've got that same phraseology, what is lacking from Amenemope's words is that it doesn't have the fear of the Lord, and he's applying it to all of life, not just to the son of the king, or for all people and not just the son of the king. So I think that in that sense, some of the social understanding and the way language works in that as well, like by cueing in with certain terminology, he is automatically within that culture triggering certain ideas. If I tell you I'm going to write a story and I'm going to begin it with long ago in a galaxy far, far away, all of you have already thought of something that is not in the text. And if I start telling you that I'm going to write a story about a father whose children were removed from him at a young age, and he and those children were raised to hate him, the idea of him, and that they sought to overthrow his empire, within that world of long ago in a galaxy far, far away, all of you, hopefully, if you're nerds, maybe, have thought of, I'm writing a story that's actually contra to the story that we see from George Lucas. I'm actually writing one in defense of Darth Vader, perhaps. And so, but you have that social construct that is not necessarily in the text. And so I'm exploring those avenues now, without denying the compositional nature, if that makes sense.
So I'm going to ask you, Dougald, we're at an hour. Do you want to take another question or two, or?
We cannot let the session end with the idea of social background and the importance.
This is true.
Let me just say,
I noticed when you were talking, he leaned this way. I can see that.
I know. I was worried. So just again, for the importance of this idea of composition, is the author of the Pentateuch does not utilize the Genesis 15 episode, in reference outside to that episode. I don't think whatsoever. He's using it because it's connections to other texts in the Pentateuch. And so again, the question is, does it reveal a setting? Well, Dougald's point is, yes, it does. But again, that's not why the author is using it. As a matter of fact, the author, again, is a long time removed from those settings. And to me, it's kind of ludicrous to think that he is assuming that his readers will assume some information that's 500-600 years at best, right? That's at best 506 years removed, without any kind of historical training and maybe knowledge of these texts or these ideas. Again, there's all kinds of problems with that. But here it is in a text, and obviously his readers are reading Genesis 14, Genesis 16, Genesis 1, Deuteronomy 33, and so on and so forth. So, anyway.
Well said.
So, do you want to take another question, or are we? I mean, we're at.
It really depends on Seth's time.
I charge by the hour. Sure, no problem.
All right. Before we take Benji's second question, does anyone else have a question they'd like to ask? All right. Where did I put that mic? Oh, you've got the microphone.
Thank you all for sharing. Just to put this in conversation with some other evangelical scholarship, would Sailhamer affirm or be against like double fulfillment of prophecies, Messianic prophecies? Does he see these as a direct prophecy, like in Isaiah or Genesis 3:15? Are these directly about the Messiah, or are these indirectly? And is the last days kind of part of your way of filtering and understanding those as being about something, hundreds of years later for the original readers?
That's an excellent question, and I would just simply say, like, Isaiah 7 would be case in point. I assume that's the passage that everybody thinks of when you mention double fulfillment. But again, with compositional approach, your desire is to understand the intent of the author, right? And so Isaiah 7 is not intended to be interpreted in terms of its historical background, but in terms of its literary context. And so you have to understand Isaiah 7 within the context of 1 through 12, right? And so it seems pretty clear that the author of Isaiah is understanding Isaiah 7 with reference to the same child of chapter 9 and the root of, the shoot in chapter 11. So I have never, and I'm always afraid to talk what Sailhamer, I mean, it's just a scary thing to say. So I take full credit. I have never heard Dr. Sailhamer talk about double fulfillment. I'd never heard him, if you ever wanted to really get his dander up, you'd talk about progressive revelation, or how about redemptive history, right? Those were things that he just really kicked back. But, again, the goal of understanding any particular passage is within the context of the whole book. And we don't need to understand what Ahaz was thinking. It's irrelevant. I don't need to get into Ahaz's head. I simply need to see Isaiah 7 within its literary context. That's its meaning.
And that's what we affirm as evangelicals, right? 2 Timothy 3:16. It's the graphe that's the apostas, not and to be quite honest, not even Isaiah the person so much. I mean, I even say it's, at this particular moment, I don't even need to get into Isaiah's head, right? I mean, I just need to understand Isaiah as he gives it in the rest of his book. There's connections between the narrative in chapter 7 to the narratives in chapters 36 through 39. It's, there's all these terminological connections. So not only 1 through 12, but in 1 through 66 is really what I'm concerned about. And one other passage that Dr. Sailhamer did often mention as it relates to double fulfillment is the idea of Solomon in the book of Kings. Well, the author of Kings makes it very clear that Solomon is not any type of fulfillment, quite the opposite. Although Solomon himself thinks he's the fulfillment, right? But the author of Kings, no way. Solomon, I won't say what he is, but he's not good, right? He's not the Messianic fulfillment in the book of Kings. So.
Okay, great question, Joe. I would have included that, but I only have a limited number of questions I can include. Maybe one more. Last two have been very penetrating, good questions. So maybe a third penetrating question. Is anyone else? Yeah, here I got you.
Do you have any thoughts on how you see the New Testament writers like Paul using the literature and not really even the historical or the social context? Or do they? But I want to know more about your thoughts about the literary context.
Well, I would just simply say that even, I'll never forget that, actually it was for a Dr. Black class here. I remember just simply applying some of the principles of compositional analysis to the epistle to the Romans. and the same types of things going on. You have literary inclusios in the introduction to the conclusion. You've got key phrases that appear only in the seams and the major transitions of Romans. You know, things like adoption that appear only in chapter 8 and then only in chapter 9 that links those two sections together. And so I just, again, I think what Sailhamer taught me to do is to be very sensitive to the textual nature of literature. So I mean that would be my observation, is that we, you know, to understand a letter and, you know, Pauline letters is to read them over and over and over and over again to get a sense in which they have been put together.
Well, even more so his turning to the Old Testament text, their usage of the Old Testament literature.
So I'll just say one thing real quickly, again, in piggybacking on what Seth said, was that, again, I think it's really important that we understand the way these texts were made. So from a New Testament perspective, which I was always told to stay out of, but as a teacher, but anyway, from a New Testament perspective, they're obviously not, it's not the same issue that we have going on in these Old Testament texts per se, because again, the great span of time which some of these books were made, you know, like you think about the Book of Kings and the time span they cover, and range of materials, the paucity of materials available, right? I mean, Moses had much less, you know, writing pieces to deal with than Paul, who probably was just writing letters, right? Moses, in that sense, might have never written a book, which is why it's so important to think about how they were made or put together. But it sounds like your question is, I think, again, I know we have many kind of little quips that Dr. Sailhamer probably used, those sayings, but I always go back to think about the title that Paul, in particular, has for the Old Testament, and it's the Law and the Prophets, or the Law of the Prophets of Moses, or I'm sorry, David, or Moses and the Prophets. So I think, you know, Paul is looking at this, what we call the Old Testament, as, you know, Moses and the Prophets. And so you even see, again, some of the way he's looking at these things that tell you how he's going to interpret them, if that was kind of in response to your follow-up question.
Well, I don't know if this may be dealing with what you're asking on a more micro level than, but like I'm thinking about Galatians and the allegory of Sarah and Hagar, which is really funny because everybody, you know, when you read people about hermeneutics, they're like, don't do what Paul is doing here, except for the fact that he's actually keying in on a wordplay that's going out throughout that entire narrative about bond and free, or the slave woman and the master. And so I think he's actually keying on the textual and literary issues that are in the text that are not, that we don't feel comfortable with from in some of our hermeneutics. And I think that's actually a great example of his allegory, is actually a great example about how to read two narrative texts that are side by side, and seeing the wordplay that goes on in Genesis there to draw theology from it.
One of Sailhamer, he used to say this all the time. He said, you know, why a lot of times modern scholarship is wrestling with the New Testament use of the Old Testament. He said, if we're ever going to understand the New Testament use of the Old Testament, we have to first develop a concept of the Old Testament's use of the Old Testament. And, you know, it's really Moses that's taught me to read Matthew. Because the same things that Moses does in terms of the book of Moses, in terms of, you know, parallels and what Sailhamer would call narrative typology, these are things that are part of the fabric of the meaning structure of the Pentateuch. And so, you know, what I would just simply say is that concept of the Old Testament's use of the Old Testament, to the extent to which I'm more sensitive to the ways in which the Old Testament has meaning and how the Old Testament relates to, you know, prophets studying prophets, the New Testament use of the Old Testament becomes less and less of a problem. That used to be such a problem for me. The New Testament use of the Old Testament. I was scratching my head. And, you know, one day I'm going to give Dr. Sailhamer a hug. Again, I'm just going to thank him. You know, because he helped me to realize that,
to appreciate New Testament use of the Old Testament is just simply to be a better reader of the Old Testament.